Today, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to walk through how I would help a student assess their own master copy and figure out where to go from there once they have created it. So for today, I have a Sargent self-portrait master copy that my student John did. John does a great job of assessing his own work, and so he didn't really have any questions about this. So I'm going to take this piece, which was overall a really successful one, and I'm going to go ahead and walk through how I would help a student to assess this piece if they didn't happen to have questions. This is going to be applicable if you are working on master copies of your own, or even if you're working on original pieces. This should give you a really solid sense of how to assess your own work. So the number one thing I'm actually going to start with is John's reference for this piece. Whenever somebody is doing something like a master copy, I find it is essential to get as high resolution of an image to work off of as possible. So in this particular case, this reference, this Sargent self-portrait reference, came off of Wikimedia Commons. It is a very high resolution image. As you can tell by the fact that it's only at 50%, I have a very big screen that I'm working off of, and there's quite a lot going on here. So if I actually zoom in, we can really start to see a lot of the particulars of the brushwork here, which is very helpful when you're working on really understanding another artist's way of working. Really being able to tell what the order of the brush strokes going down must have been, being able to see the degree of impasto or the degree to which you have something like dry brushing or there's textural changes in the brush marks. Those are really helpful. So whenever possible, I would encourage you to find really high resolution versions of these master works to work off of. I find Wikimedia Commons is great for that, especially for old masters. Same thing goes for museums. Museums often have very high resolution images that you can download to study from. So first things first, if a student went ahead and submitted something like this and said, okay, Chelsea, I've completed my master copy, what's your general feedback? The first thing I would actually say is that I would love more context for this. So whenever I critique a student's work, I always like to know, okay, what was the piece that came right before this? Like, about how successful is every piece, about where's the skill level at for all of the pieces that came before this one. That way, I am not simply going in blind and saying, oh, well, you could fix this and this and this and this. If this piece was a huge breakthrough, I want to build on the breakthrough, not find little ways to nitpick it and really undermine the breakthrough that student had. So if we were to imagine that John had really struggled to be painterly or to capture a likeness before this piece, those things are not the case, but let's go ahead and imagine that they were. What I would say first and foremost is I would actually want to hear from John what set him up for success on this piece, what allowed him to capture the likenesses effectively, what allowed him to really loosen up with the brushwork. I want to understand all of the variables that go into a successful painting so that we can actually intentionally bring those variables into future pieces so that you are more likely to be set up for success. In my experience, getting to this place of mastery is exactly that. There's a lot that goes into studying and really making sure that you have a solid understanding of your fundamentals and getting your skills in a good shape. But another really big part of it is paying attention to what sets you up for success and what sets you up to have a frustrating painting. As a part of this context, I like to see several different things. I want the context of knowing what you've been working on up until now. I want to see the reference you're working off of. So for this particular video, I have a really high resolution version of this Sargent painting. But if John happened to be working off of a piece that was super, super compressed and the biggest he could get, the painting was like this big, I could see how it would be difficult to really study the brushwork because I can't see the brushwork at this size, and that is not fair to yourself to ask yourself to overcome a technical hurdle like that. So I always like to see the reference. I like to make sure that there's enough visual information there that if something went wrong, we can really decisively pinpoint a skill issue versus there was just something in the setup that made this an uphill battle the whole way. Second thing is I like to go ahead and make sure that the crop of the reference matches the crop of the actual painting. Now, this isn't a universal rule. I happen to just find this really helpful because both for the painter and for myself, it helps me to get an understanding of what was happening with the drawing in this piece. By having the crop match between the two of them, I can not just assess how accurate the drawing looks for the positive space in the painting, that is like the subject itself, the things we're really focused on. I can also use negative shapes such as the shape of the background around the subject in order to really make sure the drawing is working. So for my very first step here, that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. And I think to make this easier, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy John's painting and I'm going to paste it into the Sargent piece. So if a student is concerned that they haven't matched the likeness, this is the first test that I want to take a look at. Now, oftentimes when I'm taking a look at something myself, I can get a gut impression of what's going on with the drawing. After all, this is what we train ourselves to do. We train ourselves to be able to look at something really quickly and assess whether our drawing of that thing is accurate without necessarily needing extra tools. But if I want to make this really clear for a student, I love this tool. It makes it really, really clear what exactly is going on. And if you're ever stuck and you aren't sure what's actually going wrong in your painting, this is such a helpful tool. And you don't necessarily need Photoshop. That is the program that I'm using because that's what I'm used to. That's what I have here on my computer. But I've seen students use all sorts of programs to do this exact same thing. So long as you have layers, you have the ability to adjust the opacity of those layers so that you can see the overlay, and you have the ability to like move that top layer around and then scale it so that it fits, you should be in solid shape. So if John came to me and he said, I just feel like I haven't quite captured Sargent's likeness in this, this would be the first thing I would take a look at. And what I can do is I can quickly toggle between these two layers. And we can very quickly see that the main thing that's happening here, assuming that we keep all the main landmarks of the collar, the shoulder, the overall outline of the head, location of the mouth, location of the ear, as well as things like the hairline and naturally the eyes and the nose, the features that are really grounding this painting. If we keep all of the periphery accurate, what we can see is that the eyes are a little bit far apart and that this eye on the left is a little bit high. The nose also is a little bit wide and a little bit long. So if I toggle between these, you can see, here's John's version, and watch that left eye travel in as I toggle to Sargent's version. You can see it come in and down. Similarly, you can see the nose kind of get a little slimmer and also move up as I go from John's to Sargent's. And of course, there are some very slight differences, getting the specificity of the shadow shape or the exact length of this little strand of hair, or this little point that's at the bottom of the ear. Those things I don't consider as important as nailing that overall facial proportion. And so if John wanted to keep working on this, I would say the first thing I would do is potentially adjust this left eye, make sure the nose is shifted accordingly. That's also going to move the mustache up just a little bit, just so it's actually matching with the new height of the nose. Now, the next thing we might want to take a look at is the value structure of this working? Now, this is a pretty tricky thing to assess in this case because I can just tell from this photo that John took that his camera didn't really capture the values or the color of what he is painting accurately. This is super common, and it's easy for me to tell at a glance that this is darker than he painted it, but I can see that overall the color looks good. It like just my brain is kind of making that modulation. I can see the same peachy tones. I can see where we go into the browns. I can see where we get into like mousy neutrals of things like the facial hair. What it is difficult to see is like just how precise are those things. And there's a little bit of the value structure that just gets lost because this background is so dark, the way that the camera captured this. Oftentimes I'll have students tell me that an image is not actually representative of what it looks like in person. So if this were my painting and I were assessing this, what I would probably do is I would actually take a look at the Sargent piece on a monitor. I would try and adjust that monitor so it's not blaringly bright, because that will mean that your whites are actually whiter than the lights on your particular painting. But I like to look at them side by side, really step back and see if any values or colors are jumping out to you as being inaccurate. One other way you can do this is to potentially put all of this in grayscale and like really check those values. So just to show you an example of what I mean by that, I just copied the Sargent painting layer. I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and go to black and white. I'm just going to leave default settings for this. And then similarly, I'm going to copy John's painting. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to go to black and white, default settings. You can do this via adjustment layers if you're a Photoshop whiz. I am not, so I'm doing it this way. Now, once this is in black and white, I think some of those value relationships become much clearer. Just the extent to which the shadow side of the face is a lot lighter than it appears. Again, I would take this with a grain of salt if this were my painting, just because I know this photograph of the painting isn't capturing the value super well. But if you do have a photo that you feel like is as close as possible to what your painting does, I really love using this to get a really fast understanding of, is this a color problem or is this a value problem? If you see it in black and white, if you see that difference between the two, what that in all likelihood means is that you have a value problem first. And if you can figure out that value piece, more than likely the color is going to fall into place. But if you do these assessments, if you check your drawing and all of the landmarks line up, if you check the value and like they just look like the spitting image of one another in value, but something still doesn't look right with the color, then that actually tells you, okay, we have successfully diagnosed this as a color problem by process of elimination. And if you make sure that you stick with your values, but just modulate the hue or the saturation, this should take care of whatever issue that we see. And then the final thing that we can take a look at when we're assessing a master copy is the brushwork, and by extension, the texture and the edges created by that brushwork. So let's go ahead and we're going to go back between Sargent's version and John's version. Again, this photograph is a little bit like lower resolution than what we see in Sargent's painting, so there's not a ton of information that we can get, but I think if this were my study, if I were studying this particular piece, I would want to look at moments like these two little brush strokes in the facial hair. Potentially some of the simplicity of the brushwork around the chin. Similarly, I would be really interested in the impasto that's created on the forehead. And then finally, I really like this one just very decisive stroke capturing that lock of hair that is out of place. So while I can't get a super close look at what John did here, what I can see is that we have a couple of more marks in these key areas than what Sargent has. That's not unusual. It's a master copy. You will often put down a mark and then make an adjustment, and that's just kind of like a sacrifice we have to make. This happens to me on my paintings all the time. So if I notice this in my own master copy, what I would say is that I want to go ahead and really focus in my next painting on really prioritizing trying to do these interesting clear strokes in one go and see if I can do that successfully. Especially if the drawing's working, the value's working, the color's working, that tells you that the only thing left is getting the right mark and putting it in that right place. This is always a work in progress. I often have these observations like every time I do a master study. In the next one, I won't get every one of those marks the way I wanted, but I might get one more than I might have before. So I hope watching me go through and assess this master copy has helped you to understand how to troubleshoot why something has gone wrong and give you a sense of how to fix it in your own work, whether you're working on a master copy or an original. If you really like this way of getting feedback, if you like the clear breakdown of really diagnosing and understanding what part of the painting needs to be adjusted, this is exactly the kind of critique that I give all of the time within my program, the Alla Prima Bootcamp. There's more details below in the description, and there is also a link to apply to see if we are a fit to work together. The way that the application works is that you go ahead and submit that application. I give it a look over, make sure this looks like it is a really promising fit. From there, you and I would get on an interview call to really dig deep into exactly what's going on with your painting practice right now and where you want to go. And based on that call, if I know I can help, I'll be happy to tell you more about the bootcamp and how my mentorships work. All right, I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And until next time, happy painting.